Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this recording of a session that unfortunately we couldn't do live, but we're going to do it for you now so that it makes sure that our complete record of all these wonderful tales of the Bible story stay with us. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy this telling of the story of King Saul and the Monarchy, as we once again welcome Barbara with us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We left the end of session 8 with the story of Samuel, the prophet, choosing the tall and handsome young man Saul from the southern tribe of Benjamin to be the first king of the Israelites, and anointing him with oil in secret. The people had begged for a king initially to be a more authoritative leader in battles against the Philistines. And later they added, in order that we may be like the other nations. Now, these two reasons herald a confusing collection of different stories of how Saul was chosen for this new role among the Israelites. And so we have some issues to note before we get into the stories of King Saul's reign. First, it's of interest to realize that Samuel did not put a crown on the head of Saul to make him king, but poured oil on his head and anointed him. This act has a very ancient history, going back to the very distant times in Central Africa, where warring tribes would choose their leader, anoint him for the job, and follow him loyally, but only for as long as he was a winner. They had separated him from the ordinary ranks of people with oil to be a sacrifice. It would certainly focus his mind on winning, because eventually he knew he would be the sacrifice when he failed to be the winner. And they would place him on his funeral pyre. Makes you think of a modern barbecue, doesn't it? Oiling the sacrifice to put on the fire. When they had sacrificed him, they would then choose their next winner. It's interesting to note that long after these times, anointing was, and still is, a symbolic act of separating someone away from the ordinary for a special purpose. It still is at the heart of our own national coronation service. In 1953, for those who can remember it, the Queen was stripped of all her jewellery, and her fine clothes were covered with a simple pleated white gown before the Archbishop anointed her with oil, first on her head, then her breast for her heart, and both her hands, all done symbolically in private underneath a canopy. Do you remember? Canopy held by 4 lords, and the Archbishop ready to anoint her. Underneath the canopy, because anointing always is a very solemn event. Only after that was she led to the coronation chair and dressed up in all the clothes of royalty, culminating in the hat, i.e. the crown. That's the Queen underneath the canopy, and there's a picture of the anointing oil container and the lovely gold spoon that is used for taking the oil and pouring it onto the Queen's head, breast and hands. And anointing, of course, is still used nowadays to separate someone for a special reason. Their baptism, perhaps, their ordination, or before a special event in their lives, like a pilgrimage, and even before the last human journey towards imminent death. But secondly, the question arises, why are there different stories telling us of this momentous change in the experience of the Israelites? They come from differing written accounts of people's memories. We've already noted that writing in the Hebrew language was beginning to spread among the traders of Canaan. Very few people could write, and kings began to employ writers, or scribes, to keep their official records. And within a century following the time of Samuel, the Israelite kings were beginning to do the same. And the writers, the scribes, also began to record their ancient tribal stories. Remember, we met them, edited together in the J and the E codes of the patriarchal stories in Genesis. But we now meet them again in the memories of King Saul's reign. Lots of stories? Well, at least two, because we're at the beginning of careers in journalism. And we all know today how the same events can be described very differently by journalists. Those writing in the Guardian newspaper, for example, or those writing for the Daily Telegraph. Some argue in favour of the issue, and others argue, sometimes vehemently, against it. And so it was with the new experience in Israel of having a king. Like the other nations? No, not yet. Israel was still only a collection of tribes, bound loosely together by a covenant with their God, Yahweh. And it was his law they were bound to keep, not laws made by a human king. In Israel, opinions were divided for centuries whether human kings were a good idea or not. And some journalists were very outspoken in their criticisms, very unlike the other nations. So now, back to young Saul, bewildered, excited, confused by Samuel's unexpected action, anointing him to be a king, and in secret, and then sending him to go back home alone. Was it real? He must have wondered. And this first story continues with Samuel telling Saul of 3 events he would meet on his journey home to endorse what had happened in reality. Samuel said first he would meet 2 men who would tell him that his father's donkeys had been found, and now his father was wondering what had happened to his son. And next he would meet 3 people going to make a sacrifice to Yahweh at Bethel, who would give him some bread. And thirdly, he would meet a band of roaming prophets performing their frenzied rituals, and Saul would find himself drawn into the frenzy with them. After that, said Samuel, Saul was to go to Gilgal, where he, Samuel, would join him to offer sacrifice there. Saul was astonished when it all happened as Samuel had said. He must have been in a very bewildered state of mind, so much so that he quickly lost touch with reality or normality, got caught up in the frenzied ecstasy of the prophets, to the extent that the first hint of criticism is heard. Is Saul one of them? Well, Saul went home, where his uncle asked him where he'd been. Saul told him about meeting Samuel and hearing the news that the donkeys had been found, but he told his uncle nothing about the matter of kingship. And thus ends the first story, a legendary story. Saul went looking for his father's donkeys and found a kingdom. The next story tells us that Saul was publicly chosen by the casting of lots among the tribes at Mizpah, where Samuel had summoned the elders. First, the tribe was chosen, Benjamin, then the clan, and then Saul's father, and finally Saul himself, who was really trying to hide from all the publicity. When the people found him and he was presented to the big crowd of people, they were mesmerized by his stature and handsome good looks, and shouted, "Long live the king!" Samuel told the people what the new system would mean, and the rights and duties of a king, before dismissing the assembly and sending them all home. And the first skeptic note can be heard from some worthless fellows who asked, how could this man possibly save them? But the story continues when about a month later, news came that some Israelites were suffering badly at the hands of King Nahash, king of the Ammonites, on the other side of the river Jordan. When news reached Saul, he was driving a pair of oxen in the field, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and in his anger he took the yoke of oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent a piece to all the regions of the Israelites, threatening to do the same to them if they didn't come immediately to help. Definitely a new air of authority. The stunned people have responded in their thousands, and under Saul's command, they won a huge victory. And then when they told Saul to have his detractors put to death, when they told Saul to have his detractors put to death, he refused, saying, no one shall be put to death this day, for today Yahweh has brought deliverance to Israel. They all went to Gilgal, where they made Saul king publicly before Yahweh, before rejoicing greatly. Thus ends the next story. Before the next one, however, we have in chapter 12 a sermon in full Deuteronomic style put into the mouth of Samuel, reminding people of their past history and telling them that even now they have a king, all will be well, but only providing that they all remain loyal to Yahweh and keep the condition of their covenant to worship him alone. But if they rebel, disaster will fall on them and on their king. The time went by, and all seemed very well. Saul grew in stature and in leadership, but not like the other kings of other nations. He didn't build himself a palace not stuffed with umpteen servants. He didn't live in a state of pomp and glory. He didn't even establish a harem full of delightful wives. He seems to have lived modestly, with a young family of 3 sons and 2 daughters. His eldest son, Jonathan, grew up like his father, a good soldier and leader of men. The day came eventually when Saul was near Bethel with his troops, and a smaller contingent was in the far south with Jonathan. And Jonathan, on his own initiative, led an attack on the Philistines at Geba and won. The result, I'm afraid, was only to be expected. The Philistines mustered for revenge, and it was fierce. The Israelites were soon very hard pressed, hiding in caves and holes in the ground, while Saul up in the north waited for Samuel to arrive for a sacrifice to Yahweh to plead for his help. Days went by, and now Samuel, now an old man, did not arrive. In his anxiety, Saul offered the sacrifice himself. And Samuel arrived just as he had finished. Samuel was furious because Saul had exceeded his authority and taken over Samuel's authority as well. He wouldn't listen to Saul's explanation. Was it jealousy or fear that Saul was getting above himself? It was certainly the beginning of the rift that developed between the 2 men. The rift which made Samuel begin to think he'd made the wrong choice years before in choosing Saul. Pardon me. More time went by, and there were many more skirmishes between the Philistines and the Israelites. The Israelites harried the enemy with all sorts of guerrilla attacks, especially the troops led by Jonathan, whose bravery was remarkable. There were small, sporadic victories sometimes, but never a decisive one for either side, in spite of the iron weapons the Philistines still had. They kept a grip on the secrets of the smelting iron and forced the Israelites to go to them and pay to get their plowshares, axes and sickles sharpened. Samuel kept his distance all this time. He didn't support the army by offering sacrifices after their victories so that they could eat meat and keep up their physical strength. Eventually, Saul did this for them, and eventually, for the first time, built an altar himself. Saul was certainly feeling lonely without Samuel's encouragement. A bit like Boris without Dominic Cummings, perhaps. And inevitably began to operate in more recognisable kingly fashion and feel himself on the same social level with the other kings in the area. The day did come, however, when Samuel suddenly reappeared and asserted himself, ordering Saul to go out to battle with the Amalekite people, and in the same way as before, to celebrate the victory he would win by killing every one of the Amalekites, every man, woman and child, and all their animals as a sacrifice to Yahweh. Well, the battle took place, and Saul indeed had a decisive victory again. But times had changed. He did indeed kill the people, but spared their king, Agag, who after all was a king like himself. His soldiers likewise killed some of the animals, but kept the best and all that was valuable. Samuel was angry. He was losing his influence. He set out to meet Saul, who was near Mount Carmel, setting up a monument for his victory. When he challenged Saul about the hearing bleating of animals, Saul replied that they'd been kept alive to be offered properly as a sacrifice to Yahweh. But Samuel was not impressed. Even when Saul apologized, Samuel's anger did not melt. It was the final showdown between the two of them. Samuel pronounced Yahweh's displeasure at Saul's disobedience and his rejection of Saul as king. Samuel's last act was to summon King Agag and hacked him to death himself before storming off back to his home in Ramah, regretting that he'd ever chosen Saul to be king. And the two men never met again. Chapter 16 begins a new story in which we are introduced to a young boy called David. It does not begin with a traditional birth story, but a unique story heralding many good things to come. Do remember, though, that the next stories were written down within living memory of the events they describe by the later employees of King David, and therefore written to enhance his reputation at the expense of any sympathy for Saul. It begins with Samuel, prompted by Yahweh, going to the small city of Bethlehem in the southern area of Judah to visit Jesse and choose one of his sons to be anointed to replace Saul. And in order not to arouse suspicion, he took an heifer and went to offer a sacrifice, making sure, of course, that Jesse was invited. The city elders were filled with foreboding, but Samuel assured them that he came in peace, and the sacrifice went ahead. At the festive meal that followed, Samuel watched Jesse's sons. The eldest, Eliab, impressed Samuel with his good looks, But he'd made that mistake before. He needed to find the right person this time. So Samuel did not choose Eliab, or Abinadab, or Shammah, or any of the rest of Jesse's family at the feast. In desperation, he asked Jesse if he had any more sons. Jesse replied, yes, the youngest one is keeping guard with the sheep. So Samuel asked that he be sent for. And on his arrival, Samuel felt the prompting of Yahweh to choose him, even though he also was ruddy, handsome, and had beautiful eyes. Samuel anointed him quietly in among his brothers, and David was inspired by the Spirit of Yahweh. But nothing more happened then. Samuel merely went home to Ramah. We now have two different stories to explain how the young shepherd boy came to court and engaged the attention of King Saul. The first story describes how Saul was missing Samuel's support to the extent that he began to have bouts of depression. As these began to get worse, his servants thought that something must be done, and perhaps music might help. So they searched for a musician and heard of Jesse's son David, who by this time had become a soldier as well as skillful in playing. Jesse sent David to the king with presents and entered the royal household. He became a great favorite with Saul, who appointed him to the official job of king's armor-bearer. And whenever Saul was depressed, he played his lyre and soothed him back to normal. And there's a picture of the sort of harp that David would have played, and the little picture imagining how it must have looked. The second story describes more trouble from the ever-present Philistines, who made yet another assault on the Israelites. This time in the south, in the tribal lands of Judah. This time the Philistines produced a giant of a soldier who stood head and shoulders above everyone else. His name was Goliath. He came from their city of Gath. When wearing his big bronze helmet and his heavy coat of mail, with his legs protected with bronze sheaths, he looked formidable, especially when he carried a bronze javelin and a huge spear topped with iron. When he challenged the Israelite soldiers to a duel of mortal combat, Saul and his soldiers were intimidated and afraid. They had no one who would stand a chance against this soldier. And while they waited in the standoff that went on for some weeks, Jesse sent young David with provisions for his 3 older brothers who were in Saul's army, hoping to hear news of them when David returned. He was still the youngest son and still guarding the sheep. Now, the original scribe wrote the following story so vividly that I've used many of his own words to tell his story in 2 Samuel chapter 17. David arrived at the army's camp one morning, just as the call to combat was being heard again. He left his provisions for his brothers with his companion, and made his way to his brother just to find out what was happening. Just as Goliath was once again shouting his challenge to the Israelites. David then heard from the others that the king had promised his daughter in marriage to the man who would accept the challenge on their behalf. But his eldest brother Eliab saw him and was annoyed. He accused David of having abandoned the sheep just to come and watch the battle. David answered, "What have I done now?" It was only a question. Saul heard of the new arrival and sent for him, only to hear the young lad offer to take up Goliath's challenge. Saul told him he was much too young, whereas Goliath was an experienced warrior. David answered that shepherd boy he certainly was. But over the years, he defended the sheep with his bare hands. He'd killed both lions and bears, and was quite prepared to do the same to the Philistines' giant. Saul was very impressed. He sent for some armor, likewise made of bronze, and gave David a sword. But when David tried to walk, he couldn't. He'd never before experienced such cumbersome weight. He took it all off, then picked up his staff, picked up 5 small stones, like that, and put them in his pouch with his sling, and went towards the Philistines. Goliath was not amused. He was scornful of the boy's handsome youthfulness, and cursed him for his impudence. "Am I a dog," he asked, "that you come up against me with a stick? Come on then." And David's response was one of defiance. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin. I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. This very day I will strike you down and cut off your head." Well, as Goliath began to move forward, David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and he fell face down on the ground, where he was helpless. David ran towards him, but he had no sword, so he grabbed Goliath's own sword from its sheath and cut off his head while he lay helpless. The Philistines fled, and the Israelites pursued them all the way back to their own cities of Gath and Ekron, killing some and plundering the goods from their camps on the way back. And at this point, the original scribe became so excited that he wrote, "David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem," quite forgetting that at this time, Jerusalem was still an independent city-state, high on its impregnable hilltop. But meanwhile, Saul was intrigued to know more, and asked his army commander who the young man was. Abner had no idea, that the king told him to find out. And eventually, when David returned with Goliath's head, Abner met him and took him to Saul, who asked him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Now Saul's son Jonathan was watching and was enamored by the young David and wanted to be his friend. So Saul kept David, refusing to let him go home. And the friendship grew strongly between the two young men, so much so that Jonathan gave him some of his own clothes to wear at court, a belt, and even a sword. As remember, people's social status was very much determined by the clothes they were allowed to wear. Anyway, time went by, and David proved his worth in the army and won the approval of everyone. Skirmishes with the Philistines continued, and as always, Saul and his soldiers were greeted on their return by women meeting them with music and songs and dancing, rejoicing in their successes. Eventually, one day, they upset the king. They sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul heard, and deep inside himself realized that David was becoming more popular with the people than himself, and that he, David, was now a threat to himself as king. He began to be afraid of David. He even threw a javelin at him while David was playing the lyre for him. Matters deteriorated as more time went by. Saul tried to gain authority over David by offering his daughter in marriage to him. David demurred, because of his lowly origins. But Saul persisted, but set a condition that David must first present him with the penises of 100 Philistines, hoping, of course, that he'd be killed in the process. To his dismay, David did just that and became the husband of Princess Michal, who was as enamored with David as her brother Jonathan. Relations deteriorated still further between Saul and David, until Saul determined to contrive David's death. First, he enlisted Jonathan's cooperation, but Jonathan warned David and told him to keep out of the way while he reasoned with his father. But matters didn't improve. Saul's depression deepened still further. David escaped another javelin throw, but Saul was determined to get him. He sent orders to David's house to guard David, but this time his wife Michal told him and helped him to escape down from the window. She then made up his bed to look as if he was still asleep in it and told Saul's messengers that he was sick. Saul ordered his men to go to David's room and get him. But when he heard that David had escaped, he was devastated and became even more paranoid. The sad story continues, but not until we meet again next week on the 6th of February. Thank you for being here, and goodbye for now.